Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and welcome to TLC's recent installation of our Webinar Wednesday series. My name is Jameson Reynolds and I'm the Director of Marketing Strategy for the Library Corporation. Today's session is going to focus on user experience design within software for libraries. I do want to point out that TLC does have two library management software platforms. We do have CoralX as well as Library.Solution. This session is going to focus on some of the concepts and some of the features of UX that you will find within Library.Solution. We could always do a session for Coral at a later date, but primarily this session is going to focus on LS. Today's session is being led by Phil Ramuno. Phil is our user experience designer and our subject matter expert for user design for Library.Solution, and is part of our product management team here at HQ for TLC, which is located in Inwood, West Virginia. Phil, if you wouldn't mind, please take it away.
All right, thank you, Jameson, and hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon for another Webinar Wednesday. As Jameson said, my name is Phil Ramuno, and I'm a user experience designer at TLC, working primarily on Library.Solution. The topic of today's webinar is user experience design in library software and why it matters to you and your library. To give a quick overview of what I'll be covering today, I'll start by outlining the steps of our design process and why library software in particular benefits from this process. I'll be going over some of the core principles that guide how we approach ILS design, and we'll look at a workflow that's currently in development to see some examples of how this process helps determine what we build and how we build it. Finally, I'll also discuss the practical benefits of user-centered design for your library and all the subtle ways it helps speed up the work you're doing every day. If you have questions during the presentation, I encourage you to put them in the webinar chat so we can answer them afterwards when we take questions. So let's get started with a very quick overview of our user experience design process. As the name implies, the overall goal of the process is to design the best possible experience for users of our software. Now, people often associate the phrase design process with the way that something looks and feels. And while that's definitely part of the process, it's only one step in a 5-step process that's primarily focused on learning about the problem and gathering feedback from users like you on the best way to solve it. It starts with doing research to identify a problem and to learn as much as we can about the problem space. During this research, we gather data in a variety of ways, which includes reviewing current solutions to the problem, looking at enhancement requests, running polls and focus groups, and having one-on-one discussions with our customers. Once we've completed our research, we analyze it to determine who has the problem, what objectives and pain points they have, what decisions we need to make, and what challenges we're facing. Once we have the answers, those answers, we design solutions that focus on specific objectives and pain points related to the problem. And this is done very rapidly at first by wireframing lots of potential solutions so we can visualize them and weigh their pros and cons. Once we have a few promising options, we test them with users and stakeholders to see which design solves the problem most effectively and what improvements we can make that we hadn't thought of. Then we incorporate that feedback into the most promising design and test it again until it addresses all of the user's expectations, objectives, and pain points. And it can often take a few iterations through these steps to get the solution just right. Now, just to show you that we don't miss an opportunity to learn something about our users, we're going to run a quick survey right now to see if your library is currently cataloging serial items and how you're feeling about this how you're feeling about your process currently. So if you can leave your responses now, we'll take a look at those results in a few minutes. So we're looking to understand how you're using serials right now and a little bit of your future intention for maybe if you'd like to be doing more with them. I'll just give you a few more seconds there to submit your response. All right, so now that you know the process, let's look at why UX design is especially important for library software. For starters, the staff and borrowers who use library software are exceptionally diverse. That means that people of all ages, from children to senior citizens, who speak different languages and have different levels of familiarity and access to technology, are using our software. So we need to make sure we're considering the unique needs of each user here. Not only that, every library system and every physical location within the system has its own unique needs too. So it's especially important to only display information that's relevant to a specific user at a specific location and in a specific system. Because having your ILS be contextually aware of your specific requirements and preferences allows you to focus on your work and not have to consider irrelevant information that slows you down. But in order to provide all the configurations and options necessary to meet all these different needs, the ILS ends up being an extremely complex system that can be overwhelming to work with if it's not designed with users in mind. So UX design attempts to simplify systems that are complex under the hood and present them in a way that feels approachable and intuitive. And we do this by using what we've learned during our research to design a solution that anticipates the needs of our users and meets their expectations for how the problem should be solved. The way that I determine if a solution is successful or not actually has very little to do with the way a design looks, the colors it uses, or even how many clicks it takes to accomplish a task. More than anything else, it just needs to obey one simple rule, which is don't make me think. Basically, this means that when I'm looking at an interface I've never seen before, I shouldn't have to think about what I'm looking at or how to use it. It should be completely obvious and self-explanatory. And this rule doesn't just apply to designing software either. It could just as easily apply to the design of a registration form, a meeting space schedule, or even the way your collection is displayed within your libraries. Making it obvious how something's intended to be used is a crucial part of any great solution. And if the phrase "don't make me think" sounds familiar, it's because it's the title of a foundational book on web usability that you might have seen circulating at your library. It's a great introduction to user-centered design, and I highly recommend it if you're interested in learning more about this topic. Now, we also have some tactical principles that help guide us towards this overarching goal of reducing uncertainty and increasing clarity in our products. And I'll go into more detail about each of these in the next few slides, but some of our core principles include reducing the learning curve, being consistent, providing feedback, and making tools that are accessible to everyone. All of these principles advance our goal of creating products that can be used effectively with little or no training. Our first principle is to reduce the learning curve as much as possible, so our solutions are approachable and so you can get started without specialized training or having to read documentation. Some of the ways that we help reduce the learning curve include providing the right constraints so users can focus on what's relevant to speed up their workflows and prevent data entry errors. We also avoid ambiguous terms, abbreviations, and jargon. We do this to make options clear, to avoid misinterpretation, and so the tool can be understood by the average user without training. And lastly, we reduce the learning curve by breaking complex processes into smaller chunks. We do this in order to help guide users through the process rather than leaving them to figure out what to do next for themselves. We also limit the number of options shown by default to help users choose what direction they want to go, even if they aren't completely sure what they're looking for yet. There's actually a psychological theory called Miller's Law that argues the maximum number of objects an average human can hold in short-term memory is around 7. So offering too many options makes it harder to make a decision, which ultimately makes your work take longer to complete. When you're experiencing this phenomenon when you're at the grocery store and can't decide which loaf of bread to buy out of the dozens of brands, sizes, and preparations that are all available. You may have heard this referred to as analysis paralysis, and we want to avoid it at all costs. So we always want to offer you a handful of relevant options so you can quickly process your next steps and make a decision. Our next principle is that we need to be consistent in order to leverage learned behaviors. That means that we want to use what you've already learned while interacting with the ILS to give you the correct expectation for how to interact with a new feature that you're using for the first time. A simple example of a way that we leverage learned behavior is how links and buttons are colored blue throughout the ILS. We do this so you don't have to think about what's clickable when using a new interface. Instead, you immediately have the correct expectation based on your experience in other parts of the ILS. Being completely consistent is difficult, though. Components like buttons, forms, and data grids appear hundreds of times throughout the ILS. And trying to enforce a consistent UX at this scale with a manual process is essentially impossible. If not to build it, then definitely to maintain it. So we implemented a product style guide and developed a library of common ILS components to enforce consistency throughout the ILS. By taking this approach, we can now plug a common component like a data grid into a new feature, and it's going to look and feel the exact same way it does everywhere else in the ILS. And this has a few benefits. First, it helps users learn new interfaces faster by using layouts and interactions that they're already familiar with. Next, it speeds up development of new features and lowers maintenance time by greatly reducing the complexity of our code base, which means we can spend more time building new features and less time fixing existing ones. Our next principle is to provide feedback. That means that every mouse click should tell you the current status of the application, your current options, and your next step if you're in a multi-step workflow. Not answering these questions makes you think things like, did that work? Can I do that? And what am I supposed to do next? And like I said, we don't want to make you think. So providing proper feedback is a crucial part of answering these questions as they pop into your head. And by answering these questions clearly and consistently throughout the ILS, users build confidence that they understand how the system works. And this feeling of confidence is often expressed as feeling intuitive. Our last core principle is to make our solutions accessible to everyone. The first way we do this is by allowing users to navigate and interact using only the keyboard. This helps power users complete forms faster, but more importantly, it allows visually disabled users to navigate the ILS with a screen reader. Next, we want to enforce color contrast ratios so that all of our content is legible for visually impaired, dyslexic, and colorblind users. Our goal is to always meet or exceed the accessibility standards set by the W3C. And they actually have a compliance tool that we check whenever we put a foreground color on a background color to make sure that the ratio we're using meets their standard for accessibility. Lastly, we want to consider the context of use so that features are optimized for the device they're being used on and the way they're being used. For example, inventory needs to work on tablets with a barcode scanner in order for you to be able to see your progress as you're walking around scanning your shelves. This means that we need to consider what this interface looks like on a smaller screen for starters. And we also need to avoid interactions that rely on hovering a mouse to provide more information, since that won't be available on a touchscreen. We also need to optimize the workflow to allow for rapid scanning of items. So we don't want to prompt you after each scan. Instead, we want to keep the application in a state that allows you to keep scanning without any interruptions. But now that we've allowed you to scan items continuously without looking at the tablet, we can't count on your eyes to see visual feedback from the scan. So we need to use sound in a way that helps you differentiate between successful and problematic items, so you know when you need to stop and review an item further. Understanding the context and constraints of our users helps us provide solutions that are inclusive and optimized for the way users want or need to use them. So now that we know a little bit about the process and principles that guide us, let's take a look at some examples of these principles in practice with our next generation of serials workflows that are currently being developed within LS2 cataloging. But first, let's check back in on the results of our survey to see how many of you are interested in cataloging serial items. All right. So it looks like not many of you are currently cataloging serial items or are good with your current solution. And I can totally understand why. But let me show you what we're currently working on, since I think the approach we're taking might address some of the current roadblocks to this work. So our research uncovered some usability problems with existing serials applications. The problem begins with the frequency that serial items arrive and the limited resources available to accurately catalog them before circulation. This is what makes predicting serial items so appealing. It theoretically saves you time by allowing you to configure a pattern once that generates new items for you as they arrive. But the reality is that configuring the pattern isn't user-friendly and requires a lot of thinking to understand how the interface even works. So the result of these usability problems is that serial items often don't get cataloged or are cataloged with inaccurate data, which makes them harder to discover with search and ultimately reduces their circulation. And these are all big problems. Basically, configuring these patterns felt like solving a math problem, but it doesn't need to be like that if we understand the problem well enough to provide more guidance and constraints. So our solution was to make our software do as much of the work as possible and only require input from users when we can't figure out an answer based on context. This should theoretically make cataloging these items faster and more accurate, which makes them more accessible to your borrowers. So let's see what that looks like. When cataloging serials, the first step of the process is to configure the chronology and numbering patterns for the title. This allows us to customize the interface in every subsequent step of this process to only display data and options that are relevant to this specific title and item. And we'll see what that looks like in a moment. But rather than having an open-ended form at this step, like most serials applications have done in the past, we took a different approach based on the data collected in our research. It turns out that there's about a dozen chronology patterns that are in use. So rather than creating an interface that allows for a dozen valid patterns to be configured, as well as a few more dozen patterns that don't actually exist in the real world, we decided to provide some smart constraints at this step to limit the number of options available and guide users through the configuration, only asking for their input when it's absolutely necessary. So in this example, if we're cataloging a magazine that arrives monthly, I can just select monthly as my subscription frequency, and the chronology fields month and year can be deduced based on that frequency, since all of our research shows us that items that arrive monthly require a month and a year field, not a day field, not a season field. So there's no point in providing those options. It just causes uncertainty and slows you down. Instead, you can move right on to the numbering format, which can also be tricky to configure. Something we noticed about numbering patterns is that the interfaces for configuring them are often unintuitive in that they require you to save the pattern and test it to confirm it's actually doing what you want. So in our new serials workflow, we collect this pattern logic using human-readable terms and provide a real-time preview of the pattern so you can see if it's correct before you save. It's just one less thing to be unsure about before taking action, and that's always the goal. So now that we've set up our pattern, let's take a look at serial items. Serial items have many of the same attributes as a typical physical item, and they also have the same relationship to a title record. So we want you to be able to create and manage serial items using the same workflows and interactions you're already used to doing with physical items. That's why we've seamlessly integrated serials workflows into the LS2 cataloging interface so that serial items can now be searched for and edited just like any other item in your catalog. By making use of previously learned behaviors, users who have never cataloged a serial item before are able to do so successfully without having to think about where or how that type of work is done, because it fits within their existing mental model of how items are displayed and actionable in the ILS. As you see here, the grid of serial items is presented within the scope of a title, just like items of any other physical format. So the way that you'd select and apply actions here is going to be familiar to anyone who's worked with a physical item before. Also note how the June 2020 row is called out here. If you look at the arrival date, the status, or the hover over the icon, you'll see that the item was expected before today. And again, we're using the same styling to call out this problematic data as we currently do with something like an unverified authority. By reusing the learned behavior that yellow rows need your attention, you can find the problematic data in this interface without having to think about why the row is a different color. Another detail to note is that certain functionality is automatically added or subtracted from this interface based on the format of the title you're looking at. So in this example, National Geographic is a magazine, which is one of the formats we've identified as requiring serial functionality. And since only serial formats like magazines require a subscription pattern or textual holdings, these options would automatically be hidden for titles in non-serial formats like a book. By hiding irrelevant options, we allow you to focus on what's relevant and don't force you to think about unrelated options and possibly cause confusion around what you're supposed to do next. So we've seamlessly integrated serial items into the same workflows you're already using for physical items, and that includes the item editor too. So here we are in the serial item editor. And again, we're using existing patterns to make editing these items more intuitive for users who are already familiar with cataloging physical items in LS2 cataloging. The main differences are that serial items have an item type, they have a new status of expected and an expected date, and they have chronology and numbering fields that match the patterns we established in the configuration step. And that's the main thing to note here, is that a typical physical item only has inputs for year and copy number, but that isn't specific enough for a serial item. A serial item could include months, days, or volumes that are all important data points to catalog if you want to be able to find that specific item later. And on top of that, the chronology and numbering fields are unique to each title. So this is an example of somewhere that we attempt to reduce the learning curve for this interface by providing the right constraints. We could have just used free text inputs for chronology and numbering data and called it a day here. It would have been much easier to build, but the long-term result of that decision is inconsistent data that can't be easily searched. So we need to consider that constraint and pain point when coming up with a solution. And since we already configured the chronology and numbering pattern for this title in the first step, we can use those settings to determine what should display here. Since we configure this title to arrive monthly, you're presented with a month selector and a year input, so that you don't have to think about how the date should be formatted. Additionally, we provide 12 pre-formatted options for the month field and validate the year field to ensure it contains exactly 4 numbers. By providing these constraints, we can eliminate the possibility that data is entered in the wrong format, which again makes it easier to search for later. Another example of a smart constraint in this interface is the workflow for cataloging a double or triple issue. We looked at a bunch of data around how double and triple issues were being cataloged in our current serials application. And the result of that research was that they follow a mostly predictable pattern. The only thing that varies between titles is whether or not the chronology and numbering values are displayed as a single value or a range of values. So here's what the interface for configuring a double issue ended up looking like. We didn't want users to leave the item editor or make changes to the subscription pattern to handle these items, because we consider them to be an exception to the existing pattern rather than a new pattern that should be followed for all future items. We also know a few things about double issues. We know that a double issue has 2 different chronology and numbering values, representing each of the 2 issues. We also know that those values are always going to be consecutive. So in this example, if the first chronology value is November 2020, we can be confident that the second value will be December 2020. But what we don't know is how the publisher has chosen to display those values on the cover of the item. So it turns out that the only thing we really need to know when cataloging that holiday double issue at the end of the year is if the chronology and numbering is displayed as on the cover as a single data point or as a range. And rather than forcing you to think about how to update the subscription pattern to allow the fields that you need to catalog this properly, we simply ask you if the item is a double or triple issue and use what we know about how these patterns increment and reset to determine the display options you'd need here. This approach is much more intuitive because you don't have to deeply understand how the system works to figure out how to handle this situation. You just have to tell us that it's a double issue and choose from 2 possible options. This is a great example of a process that's very complex under the hood, but it's very simple to use thanks to some smart constraints that anticipate the needs of our users. Next, let's take a look at the interface for predicting items that are expected in the future based on the title subscription pattern. The first thing you might notice is that the interface is very similar to the duplicate item interface in LS2 cataloging. And again, using previously learned behaviors as much as possible to reduce the learning curve. And just like when duplicating an item in LS2 cataloging, the action's based on an existing item. In this case, we've chosen December 2020 as our starting point because we just renewed our current subscription until the end of 2021. And by using an existing item as the starting point, we can use data from that item to tell us what the chronology and numbering of the next item should be. Being able to quickly add new items that pick right up where the last one left off allows you to add another year of items with just a few clicks, while also ensuring that the subscription pattern is being enforced accurately, as you can see here. So now that you've seen how TLC is incorporating UX design principles into our next generation of serials workflows, type yes into the webinar chat now if this is something that you're interested in for your library. So now that we've talked about some of our core principles and looked at examples of how they guide the products we develop, I wanted to conclude with some practical benefits of the UX design process for you and your library. First, it results in software that's easy to learn, which reduces training time and gets new staff members and volunteers contributing faster. It allows you to accomplish tasks within the ILS efficiently and collaboratively, which helps you get work done faster and more accurately. And all this time saved means you have more time to spend with borrowers or just to work on other things. Being able to input data quickly and accurately also makes your library's content more accessible and easier to find in your pack. And better discoverability of your collection increases circulation and helps fulfill your library's mission of getting books into the hands of your community. And that's the ultimate goal of what we're striving for here, making it as easy as possible for you to manage your collection and for your borrowers to find it and benefit from it. So that concludes my presentation. Be sure to check out Don't Make Me Think by Steve Krug if you're interested in learning more about user-centered design. And reach out to our sales team if you'd like to schedule a demo and see the difference user-centered design makes in an ILS, and how your library can gain some fantastic new abilities by upgrading to the latest version of Library.Solution or Carl Connect. I think we'll be putting an email address in the chat if you'd like to reach out to us about scheduling a demo. So we'll take your questions in the webinar chat now if you have any. And while we wait for questions to come in, and now that you've looked at how UX design is applied to the ILS, I'm wondering if there's any other parts of the library experience that you think would benefit from this process. So we'd appreciate if you could take a moment to respond to the survey, and we'll get started with questions.
Thanks a lot, Phil. You did give us quite a bit of information to go through this in such a great rolled out kind of succinct way. I can't say that we've gotten any questions yet in at this point, so now would be a great time, a great opportunity that if you do have any questions, then please go ahead and ask these. It is interesting to see when you look at user experience and user design, especially with Miller's Law, it is interesting, and not to try to skew the results of the survey, which I'm glad it already went away, so I can't skew the results of the survey. But looking at the layouts and architecture and options of finding information in the library, how using Miller's Law would affect libraries the way they are designed right now. That would be an interesting implementation of that. And I will say, for full disclosure, one of the many reasons why I always key on the Miller's Law for those that are on this webinar is, in addition to being the Director of Marketing Strategy prior to this, I was a product manager for the Library Corporation, and the idea of user design and simplification and making sure we don't overwhelm customers with design is a conversation that Phil and I have had in our past many times. So it's always interesting to see him lay it out in that regard. Okay, let's see if we've gotten any questions in.
So I see one about the style
you mentioned using a style guide for development. What applications currently implement the style guide?
Good question. So Right now, it's currently being implemented in our LS2 cataloging and our LS2 preferences products. But just to talk a little bit about the long-term goal here, the reason we're taking this approach and what our goal is to unify all of the different workflows that happen in ILS into a single interface. So an example of that would be like the inventory and serials workflows that you were just seeing. They've now been unified into a single product within the last year as opposed to being standalone. So it's sort of a rolling process that we absorb new workflows into.
Sure, and I would like to key in at this point too that, as you noticed, Phil did mention LS or library.solution. This is again an answer that is specific to our library.solution platform. Carl also utilizes UX testing, user experience. This is just completely geared towards our LS customer base. And it's interesting that you did show elements of cataloging and serials, because we do have a question about special editions.
Yeah, so that's something that we also know as a maybe less common workflow that we still need to address. So one of the things we were going for with serials is that we didn't want to set a pattern that was so rigid that you were locked into it and not able to sort of break out of that in situations like a special edition or a double issue. Basically, the way that we handle special editions is that we allow you to change your fields within the subscription pattern per item if you choose to, in order to handle that case. We just didn't want to force you to do that for double and triple issues also, when we knew a reliable way of giving you the configuration that you needed, so that you don't actually have to go change the subscription, add your item, and then change it back. So yeah, so we can still handle those special editions. That's why we allow the pattern to be changed, but we allow you to do it one-off rather than making it something that has like a ripple effect and changes everything else. And that was based on research and feedback that we got too.
Okay. We have a somewhat of a lengthy question that just came in, and I'm going to try and parse this out. In the recent months, working from home, I've had difficulty reading print and cataloging functions, and font expansions, had difficulty on the page, breaking the page. Are there UX ways to improve readability on smaller screens often used at home? Is there a way to modify the white background when working in the module? This sounds like it would be an enhancement request to me, Phil. Is that correct?
Yeah, it definitely would. And that's great feedback. These are all great things to keep in mind. Good thing to take a look at how the page and the font sizes are actually responding to constraints, and maybe if there's a little bit more enhancement that we could add there for specific resolutions to bump up that size. But thank you for pointing that out, and that's definitely something that I'll be looking into.
All right, it looks like that was our last question that we got. I want to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. What an awesome way to look at UX and user experience in our software. Please join us next week. Next week's webinar is going to be a little different. We are looking at doing a roundtable discussion with some of our customers to discuss basically the pandemic reality in which we live in. We're going to discuss what went into shutting down, as well as opening back up, those of us that might be doing curbside versus open versus still closed, all the ramifications that went into this. We will have an interesting breakdown of some of our customers. I would welcome everyone to please join that session. It will be incredibly interesting. We will be, actually, we already have the registration page on our site now. So if you go to tlcdelivers.com/webinars, you'll be able to find the information there. Thank you all very much for attending today's session. If you ever need more information from us, please reach us on our website. It's tlcdelivers.com. Thanks again, everyone. Still stay safe, stay healthy, keep washing your hands, and I hope everyone has a nice day. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.